You woke up this morning and the first thing you did was something alone. Maybe you checked your phone under the covers. Maybe you sat on the toilet for 10 minutes scrolling through things you'd never show another person. Maybe you just stood in your kitchen in your underwear staring at nothing, existing in a way you'd never let anyone witness. That tiny moment of being completely unseen, unwatched by anyone except God, is something you experience dozens of times a day without thinking about it. Now remove it. Remove all of it. Imagine you haven't been alone in weeks. You sleep next to the same 12 people every night. You eat in front of them. You argue in front of them. You cry in front of them. You go to the bathroom and someone can hear you. There is no bedroom door. There is no bedroom. There is no door. For roughly 290,000 of the 300,000 years humans have existed, that was just life. So how did anyone live like that without losing their minds? The answer is stranger and more interesting than you'd expect, because it turns out that the absence of physical privacy didn't destroy people. It reshaped them. It changed how they fought, how they loved, how they raised children, how they thought about themselves, and how they built the social structures that eventually became everything we now call civilization. Privacy as we know it is a very recent luxury. The world it replaced was not worse. It was just radically, almost unimaginably different. Let's start with the space, because you need to actually picture it to understand what we're talking about. For most of human history, people lived in bands of roughly 20 to 50 individuals, not in houses, not in apartments, in temporary shelters, rock overhangs, open camps, or caves. And when I say temporary shelters, I mean structures that were, at best, a few branches covered in hides or grass. There were no walls in the way you think of walls. There were no separate rooms. There was no hallway between you and the person you had a fight with yesterday. Everyone slept in the same general area, usually around a fire, usually close enough to touch. Anthropologist Kim Hill, who has spent decades studying the Ache people of Paraguay, one of the best documented modern hunter-gatherer groups, describes their traditional camps as having virtually zero acoustic or visual separation between families. Everything is audible. Everything is visible. If someone is sick, everyone knows. If someone is angry, everyone knows. If two people are having a conversation they'd rather keep quiet, everyone is pretending not to listen, which is a different thing entirely from not hearing it. And this wasn't just at night. During the day, activities happened collectively. Foraging was done in groups, hunting was coordinated, childcare was shared, food processing, tool making, water collection, all of it happened within earshot and eyeshot of others. The anthropologist Polly Weissner, who studied the Jew/Hwansi San people of the Kalahari for over 40 years, documented that the average person in a traditional band spent less than an hour per day truly out of visual contact with other group members. Less than an hour per day for your entire life. Think about what that means. Think about every private moment you've had today, every scratch, every sigh, every face you made when nobody was looking. Now imagine all of those happening in front of an audience every single day. So here's the obvious question. How did people not go insane? And the answer is genuinely fascinating, because humans didn't just endure this. They developed an entire invisible architecture of social rules to create the experience of privacy without any of the physical infrastructure. They built walls out of behavior instead of wood. The most common tool was something anthropologists call civil inattention. It's a concept that sociologist Irving Goffman described in 1963, but the behavior itself is hundreds of thousands of years older than the term. Civil inattention means deliberately not noticing something you can clearly see or hear. You look away when someone is doing something personal. You don't comment on the argument you heard last night. You pretend you were asleep when you were absolutely not asleep. In modern hunter-gatherer societies, this is not just politeness. It's law. It's one of the most strictly enforced social norms in the group. Among the Hadza of Tanzania, as documented by anthropologist Frank Marlowe, openly acknowledging that you overheard a private conversation is considered a serious transgression. Not illegal in the court system sense, there is no court system. Serious in the way that matters more, everyone will think you're a problem. And in a group of 30 people where your survival depends on cooperation, being the person everyone considers a problem is about as dangerous as it gets. This is a point that modern people consistently underestimate. In a world without locks, without walls, without any physical barrier between you and everyone else, social enforcement becomes the enforcement. The rules are not written on a sign. They are embedded in every interaction, every glance, every conspicuous turn of the head away from something you could easily be watching. It is an entire system of privacy constructed out of nothing but mutual agreement and the threat of social consequences. And it worked. For tens of thousands of years, it worked. But civil inattention only goes so far. You can pretend not to hear an argument, but you can't pretend not to know that two people in your group hate each other when you eat with them twice a day and sleep 4 feet away from both of them. And this is where ancient social life gets really interesting, because the total absence of physical privacy created a set of pressures that fundamentally changed how humans dealt with conflict. In a modern city, if you get into a fight with someone, you can go home. You can close your door, not answer your phone, avoid them for days or weeks or years. Conflict can fester in private. Grudges can build in isolation. You can construct an entire narrative about how wronged you've been without ever having to confront the person again. Ancient humans could not do this. You fought with someone and then you sat next to them at dinner. You woke up next to them the next morning. There was nowhere to hide and nothing to hide behind. And this created enormous evolutionary pressure to resolve conflict quickly and publicly. Christopher Boehm, an anthropologist at the University of Southern California, who spent decades studying conflict resolution in egalitarian societies, found a remarkably consistent pattern across dozens of hunter-gatherer cultures on every inhabited continent. Disputes are addressed collectively and fast, not because people are more virtuous, because the alternative, letting a grudge simmer in a group of 30 people who share every meal and every sleeping space, is socially catastrophic. The whole group feels it. The whole group suffers. So the whole group intervenes. In many traditional societies, arguments are processed through public mediation. Both parties speak, others weigh in. A resolution is reached, or an agreement to drop the matter is negotiated, often within hours. Among the Mbuti people of the Congo Basin, studied extensively by anthropologist Colin Turnbull, prolonged interpersonal conflict is handled through a practice that is almost shocking to modern sensibilities. The group gathers, and people simply talk about it, openly, in front of everyone, sometimes with humor, sometimes with pointed criticism, until the tension dissipates. There is no private stewing. There is no quiet resentment building in a locked room. There is no locked room to build it in. Now, this sounds utopian, and I want to be careful because it wasn't. There was a cost, a significant one. If privacy means control over who knows what about your life, then ancient humans had drastically less of it than you do. Your emotional state was public knowledge. Your relationships were group property. Your mistakes were witnessed, remembered, and sometimes referenced in conversation for years. In many foraging societies, gossip is not just common, it's essential. It's the mechanism by which reputations are maintained, alliances are tracked, and social norms are enforced. Robin Dunbar, the evolutionary psychologist at Oxford famous for the Dunbar number, has argued that gossip is actually one of the primary reasons language evolved in the first place. Not to coordinate hunts, not to plan migrations, to talk about each other, to monitor each other, to keep social accounts in a group where everyone's behavior is everyone's business. And that creates something that we, sitting here with our private bedrooms and our locked phones, might find genuinely suffocating. In a world without privacy, your reputation is your most valuable possession, and you have almost no control over how it's constructed. Other people are building it for you, constantly, behind your back and to your face, based on things you did and things you didn't do, and things you did that were misinterpreted, and things you never did that someone said you did. There is no clearing your name in private. There is no PR strategy. There is just your behavior, witnessed and interpreted by 30 people who have known you since birth. This is, by the way, one of the reasons egalitarianism was so prevalent in hunter-gatherer societies. Boehm's work on this is remarkable. He argues that the transparency of communal living made it extraordinarily difficult for anyone to accumulate disproportionate power. If you killed a large animal, everyone saw it. If you tried to keep more than your share, everyone knew. If you started acting like you were better than others, the group shut it down through ridicule, ostracism, or, in extreme cases, coordinated violence. The absence of privacy was, in a very real sense, the original form of government. Total mutual surveillance, enforced by social pressure, functioning as a check on individual power, democracy by observation, But there's another side to this that doesn't get discussed enough. The question of intimacy. Because we tend to think of intimacy and privacy as inseparable, you need privacy to be intimate, right? A closed door, a quiet room, a space where only two people exist. Except that's a very modern idea. And the archaeological and anthropological evidence suggests that ancient humans experienced intimacy constantly, intensely, and in ways that would make most modern people deeply uncomfortable. In hunter-gatherer camps, physical contact between people is nearly constant. Mothers carry infants on their bodies for years. Adults sleep pressed against each other for warmth. Grooming, touching, leaning on each other. These are baseline behaviors, not special occasions. James Rilling, a neuroscientist at Emory University who studies the neurobiology of social bonds, has found that sustained physical contact triggers oxytocin release and reduces cortisol, the stress hormone, and that humans are neurologically wired to use touch as a primary mechanism for building trust and managing anxiety. Ancient humans weren't just tolerating constant proximity to others. Their brains were designed for it. We are the ones living in the unusual arrangement in sealed apartments, touching nobody for hours at a time, wondering why we feel anxious and disconnected. And here's where it gets complicated. Because if ancient humans were constantly surrounded by others, constantly witnessed, constantly in physical contact with their group, how did they handle the things that we consider the most private? The things that even in the most communal settings feel like they should belong only to you. Let's start with the most obvious one: sex. In the modern world, sexual privacy is so deeply assumed that most people have never seriously thought about the alternative. You have a bedroom. You have a door. You have walls thick enough that the neighbors probably can't hear you. Probably. Now go back 50,000 years. You're sleeping in a shelter with your entire extended family. There are no rooms. There is no door. There is barely a wall. So what did people do? The anthropological evidence drawn from dozens of studied hunter-gatherer groups across every continent is remarkably consistent. People found ways. They waited until dark. They moved to the edge of the camp. They slipped into the bush. They used the cover of others being asleep, or at least pretending to be asleep. Among the Juhoansi, Marjorie Shostak, an anthropologist who spent years with the group and published her landmark ethnography Nisa in 1981, documented that sexual activity between couples typically happened at night, very quietly, with children and other family members sleeping inches away. It was not hidden in the sense of being unknown. It was hidden in the sense of being unacknowledged. Everyone knew. Nobody said anything. The civil inattention system held. And that distinction between something being unknown and something being simply unmentioned turns out to be one of the most important social technologies humans ever developed. You don't need secrecy. You need tact. And tact, practiced at a cultural level across an entire group, functions almost identically to a locked door. But it goes beyond sex. Bodily functions, illness, physical vulnerability, all the things you do behind a closed bathroom door, these happened in view of others. Defecation typically occurred at the periphery of camp, and in most studied groups there were understood zones where people went for this purpose. But in bad weather, in the dark, during illness, the separation was minimal. You were sick in front of your people, you were weak in front of them, you aged in front of them. Every change in your body was witnessed, and there was nowhere to hide the slow accumulation of years or the sudden onset of disease. In modern life, we often process physical decline in private. We see doctors behind closed doors. We take medications nobody knows about. We cover the evidence. For most of human history, that option didn't exist. Your body was public. And then there are the children. Because if you think living without privacy is uncomfortable as an adult, imagine growing up in it. Every tantrum witnessed, every mistake observed, every awkward phase of development happening in full view of the entire community. There was no retreating to your room after an embarrassing moment. There was no room to retreat to. But here's what's fascinating. The research on child development in hunter-gatherer societies suggests that this total transparency might have actually been better for children in several measurable ways. Barry Hewlett, a biological anthropologist at Washington State University, who has spent decades studying childhood among the Akea and Ngandu peoples of Central Africa, has documented that children in foraging communities have, on average, far more adult attachment figures than children in industrialized societies. Not just two parents, a network of 8 to 12 adults who actively participate in care, comfort, and teaching. A child is never alone. A child is never unsupervised. And a child is never dependent on just one or two people for emotional regulation. When a child is upset, someone is always there. When a child needs guidance, multiple adults offer it. When a child fails at something, the failure is witnessed, but it's also immediately processed by the community rather than internalized in isolation. This doesn't mean ancient childhood was perfect. The mortality rates alone make that a ridiculous claim. But the psychological architecture of growing up with zero privacy and maximum social support is fundamentally different from growing up with maximum privacy and minimal social support, which is what a lot of modern children experience. A kid in a suburban house with a closed bedroom door and a screen and two exhausted parents is, from an evolutionary perspective, a very unusual arrangement. The child who grew up surrounded by 12 adults who watched every single thing they did was actually closer to the design specification. Now, here's a question that might seem obvious but actually isn't. If everything was witnessed, everything was shared, everything happened in front of the group, then what happened with the emotions you'd most want to keep to yourself? Grief is a good place to start. When someone died in a hunter-gatherer band, the death was witnessed by the group. The grief was witnessed by the group. There was no private mourning, no sitting alone in a dark room processing loss at your own pace. Grief was collective. It happened in real time, in front of everyone, and it was processed through communal rituals, through wailing, through shared physical contact, through storytelling about the person who died. Meredith Small, an anthropologist at Cornell, has written about how communal grief in traditional societies is often more intense in the short term, but resolves faster than private grief in industrialized cultures. The loneliest form of suffering is the kind you do alone, and for most of human history, you almost never suffered alone. And then there's the mind, the inner world, the one place that really is private, truly private, no matter how many people are sleeping next to you. Your thoughts. And this might be the most important part of the whole story, because the archaeological evidence suggests that ancient humans valued internal privacy with an intensity that borders on the spiritual. Cave art is the clearest window into this. The paintings at Lascaux, Altamira, Chauvet, and dozens of other sites dating back 17,000 to 40,000 years are frequently located deep inside cave systems, in chambers that would have required significant effort, crawling through narrow passages, navigating in total darkness with only a simple fat lamp or torch to reach. David Lewis Williams, an archaeologist at the University of the Witwatersrand in South Africa, has argued extensively that many of these deep cave paintings were produced during solitary or near solitary ritualistic experiences. The artist went alone, or nearly alone, into the earth, away from the group, away from the fire, into silence and darkness, and made something. Think about that for a second. In a world where you are almost never alone, where every moment of your life is observed and known, these people chose to crawl into the deepest, most inaccessible parts of the earth to do something by themselves. That is not a casual decision. That is someone who needs, on some fundamental level, to exist outside the gaze of others. To make something that the group doesn't get to watch being made, that is the purest expression of private life you can find in the archaeological record, and it's 35,000 years old. And there's a secondary finding here that matters. Archaeologists have found personal objects, small carved figurines, perforated shells, stones with no practical use, carried by individuals across hundreds of miles, and kept for years. These are not group resources. They are private possessions, items with meaning known only to the person who carried them. Randall White, an archaeologist at New York University, has studied Aurignacian personal ornaments from sites across Europe and argues that the emergence of personal adornment roughly 40,000 years ago represents one of the first tangible expressions of individual identity. You are wearing something that communicates who you are, and the specific meaning it carries may be something only you fully understand. That is a private inner life expressed through a public object, the secret hidden in plain sight. So here's what actually happened. Ancient humans lived without physical privacy, and they were not destroyed by it. They adapted. They built social systems that created the functional experience of privacy without any of the physical architecture. They developed norms of civil inattention so sophisticated that they worked for hundreds of thousands of years without ever being written down. They processed conflict publicly and quickly because they had no choice. And in doing so, they avoided the quiet quiet, corrosive resentment that private grudges create. They experienced intimacy at a level of depth and consistency that most modern humans will never come close to. They gossiped constantly and used that gossip as a governance system. They grieved together and healed faster for it. And when they needed to be truly alone, when they needed a moment of genuine solitude, they crawled into the earth itself and painted on the walls in the dark. And then everything changed. Agriculture showed up roughly 12,000 years ago. Settlements became permanent. Populations grew. And for the first time in human history, you could build a wall between yourself and someone else and leave it there. At Çatalhöyük, one of the oldest known large settlements, dating to roughly 7,500 BCE in what is now Turkey, houses had no exterior doors. You entered through the roof. Every home was physically sealed from every other home. Archaeologist Ian Hodder, who has led excavations at the site for decades, describes these dwellings as reflecting a new and quite intense idea of domestic privacy. Private spaces where families could exist outside the communal gaze in a way that would have been unthinkable in a mobile foraging band. And what followed over thousands of years was a slow, relentless expansion of private space. Rooms multiplied, doors appeared, locks were invented, houses grew, cities sprawled, and somewhere along the way, the social systems that had provided privacy for 290,000 years began to atrophy. We stopped needing civil inattention because we had walls. We stopped processing conflict publicly because we could retreat into separate rooms. We stopped grieving collectively because we could close a door and do it alone. We gained something real with physical privacy, control over our space, our bodies, our information, but we also lost something: the enforced intimacy, the collective processing, the knowledge that you are never, ever carrying anything by yourself because the people around you already know. Tonight, you'll probably close a door at some point. Maybe your bedroom door, maybe the bathroom door, maybe just the door to your apartment, sealing yourself off from the world outside. And in that moment, you'll feel something your ancestors rarely felt: complete, total solitude. Nobody watching, nobody listening, nobody knowing what you're thinking or feeling or doing. And it will feel normal. It will feel like the default setting for human existence. It isn't. For 97% of human history, that door didn't exist. The walls didn't exist. The solitude didn't exist. And somehow, remarkably, people managed. They loved, they fought, they grieved, they created. They kept secrets without locked rooms to keep them in. They built privacy out of eye contact and silence and the quiet agreement not to mention what everyone already knew. You are the first generation in 300,000 years that can be truly, completely, physically alone. Whether that's a gift or a loss probably depends on the night.